Hey guys, welcome back. Razirek here with another episode in our Roblox Studio Introductory series. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Make sure that you go back and check out the previous videos in the series because this is a progressive course where each lesson is kind of built off of the previous one. So to get the most benefit out of these videos, you're going to want to go back and start from the beginning and get caught up with us. If you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. Thank you for supporting the channel and following along. Really appreciate it. And a special shout out to our Reddit community. I've had a tremendous response from them. The feedback has been excellent. Thank you guys so much for checking us out and subscribing. If you have any friends that are interested in getting into developing content for Roblox, please pass them this channel's link and tell them to subscribe as well. Lately I've been publishing a video per night. I'm going to try to keep that pace going for as long as I can and see how it does. So far it's been working out pretty well, so I'm going to try to keep this up as long as I can and get these tutorials pushed out as fast as possible. Now for tonight's video, I've been receiving a few comments from you guys that have been questioning some of the other um, menu bar buttons that we haven't yet touched. And so I came up with this little tutorial to introduce some of those buttons and do some pretty neat things that we have not yet gotten to do in our previous videos. And I think this one's going to be pretty fun and introduce something that there's a lot of ways you could put it to use. It just really comes down to some creativity. But I'm sure we can come up with some really neat things that we could do with this. And to get this one set up, I went ahead and created a very basic area to build in. So we're not going to be making use of these basic templates this time. Just because it's not going to give the look that we're after and not really glue the idea together. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And so what we have here is a very basic little room here. And we will get into in later videos how I created these little cutouts and things like that in some of our more advanced techniques. But for right now, don't focus on the room. This is strictly here for visual purposes. But you'll notice I do have a spawn point here in the center of the room, so that when we go ahead and run our little scene here, we are already positioned inside the room and don't have to try to navigate in from outside. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get this started. Now, the questions that I've been receiving lately are specific to the parts panel up here. So I know we've covered part and we've covered anchor, group and ungroup. At this point, you should be familiar with what those do because we have done it directly through our Workspace Explorer here and covered the keyboard shortcuts. But we do have the menus here as well, so if I were to select multiple items, you can group and ungroup them with these buttons. And again, anchor just locks the pieces in place and prevents them from falling apart or dropping out of the sky. It basically disables physics on them. And if you remember when I introduced anchoring in a previous video, I mentioned that it's something that is not always going to be ideal for your builds, and tonight's tutorial is a perfect example of that. And the reason for that is anchoring does stop physics and motion from occurring, and tonight we are actually going to build a moving part that anchoring will actually prevent from working. So this is a great way to introduce a situation where you are not going to want to use this for the model. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and grab a cylinder here, and you'll see right away this material button. Okay, we have the part selected. Our material button, so Because I had changed these selections previously, when I spawned the part, it spawned with those properties. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. So if I delete this, I'm going to switch to, let's say, grass and green. And now when we drop a cylinder, it's spawning with those properties already set. So this can be very useful if you are going to be creating a lot of parts that you want to already have the same material and color selected without having to go through and copy or duplicate those parts. It does give you a little shortcut way to do that. And at the same time, it also lets you change the material and the color of your selection. So if we come in here and we switch this to smooth plastic, and we choose white, those properties have been applied to our part. And this can also come in handy if you have multiple parts. So if I have a sphere and a block and a wedge, all right, so I have all of these parts here. If I go through and I select them all, I can come up here and change them all at one time. So it does affect any selection that you currently have, as well as newly spawned parts. So there's a few neat ways that you can use these buttons just to kind of speed up the process of adding your parts and getting your builds set up here. I'm going to undo, and to prevent our newly spawned parts from taking on these properties, I'm just going to go back and reset things to the way that I want them here for our parts going forward. Now we have our cylinder laying on its side. I'm going to rotate it. We're going to switch this to 45 degrees so that our snapping is at a higher degree of angle here. And if you remember from before, I showed you that you can grab hold of a center of a part and drag it, and it will position itself on top of the surface below it. So doing that just kind of makes sure that we are sitting on the floor here rather than inside of it and having to manually adjust. Now I'm going to bring out our scale tool and size this down. Now if you recall from the previous videos that we've done, the properties panel reflects our size as we make changes to it. So you can see our X value is getting updated. And that can come in handy for a couple of reasons. It helps you maintain some accuracy in your sizing, but it also gives you a way to directly edit the sizes here. And you'll see if you click this arrow, it gives you a breakdown. This is X, this is Y, this is Z, and you can modify them individually, or you can modify them as a whole. And this grouping of values is what's called a vector 3. And all that means is you have 3 sets of values that collectively make up what's called a vector, which contains your X, Y, and Z properties. So this is a vector 3. And you can change these values directly in here. And by doing so, you leave the center point exactly where it's at. So if I'm scaling this, we'll go this way. You'll see that the center of my part is moving. Whereas if I were to, let's get this down to half a stud, okay. Now if I change the Y and Z values in here, so we're going to make this 0.5 and this 0.5. Now when I hit enter, so it has resized those two axes without moving the center point of our part. So very handy when you are getting into some precise builds. You figure out where you want your part positioned, and you don't want to have to remember, well, what's the shortcut for resizing from the center, and how we're going to reposition all of that. Gives you a much more controlled way of making those adjustments. So that being said, so what I've centered on here now is a size value of 1 by 0.5 by 0.5. So we have this thin cylinder. I'm going to grab my move tool and bring this on up to the ceiling. Now I want to make sure that we're touching the ceiling. And another neat trick to remember here, if you've moved the camera around and experienced some headaches with it's moving too far, I can't really get good control on it, there is a way to slow that down as well and make it a little bit more manageable. And that is by holding Shift. Now, if you hold Shift while using your keyboard controls, it's a much slower movement. And you can see the difference here. So this is without Shift, and now with Shift. And that works in all directions. So good trick to remember if you're getting frustrated with your camera, just hold Shift while you're moving things around, and it gets a lot slower and a lot easier to control. Now I'm going to duplicate this part and move it down below. And the part that we had just made, the previous cylinder that's on the ceiling, we're going to anchor this one. Okay, we want this one to be completely stationary and not move. We don't, however, want our duplicate to be anchored, so we're going to leave this off. This is going to be our moving part, and if you remember from me speaking earlier, if we anchor this, it's going to prevent motion altogether. This part will not move. So we're going to leave that unanchored. I'm going to change this to a block, and we're going to make this 1 by 1 by 1. Now I'm going to move this down a little bit so you can see what's going on here. We're going to use this surface tool for the first time. So I'm going to deselect, which is not necessary. I'm doing this just for demonstration purpose. You can keep the part selected if you want, but I want you guys to be able to see the effect that this tool has. If we come up here and we select surface, we're going to add a motor. Now the motor serves two purposes. It's going to be in constant motion, spinning motion, and whatever part is not anchored is going to be affected by that motor, and it's actually going to spin. The other thing that the motor does is it welds these two pieces together. So whatever piece it's touching, it's going to cause it to connect to that piece, similar to how our anchor works, where it keeps it from falling apart, but it doesn't prevent motion the way that anchoring does. So I'm going to select motor. And what you're going to notice is your cursor changes. So you have this little crosshair with a hand holding a motor. The reason the cursor changes is because this tool here affects a single surface of a part. It does not affect the part as a whole. So you don't need to have a selection made, which is why I deselected to demonstrate that. And at the same time, if you do have a part selected, using this tool is not going to have any effect on that part. You actually have to tell it where to apply this change. So if we hover over the top surface of our cube here, you can see that it outlines. And I'll move the camera a little bit so you can see that. So we get an outline of the surface. Now if we click, it drops our motor in place. And I'm going to get off of this here. So our cube now has this motor attached to the top surface, and if you come down to the properties, you will see that motor is now on the left surface, and this is where this particular tool really comes in handy, because as you can see, our cube has rotated, so this is no longer top, this is actually left, and instead of having to go through and try to figure out which side is which, this tool just lets us pick exactly which surface we want to apply it to, and then it figures that out for us. So now with that motor in place, I'm going to move this back up to be in contact with that cylinder. So now what's happening is this motor is now attaching these two parts together. And because we have our cylinder anchored, it's going to prevent the cylinder from moving, but because our cube is not anchored, it's going to allow it to move. And I can show you that here. I'm actually going to change the color of this though, because we have a white part and a white ceiling, and you're going to have a hard time really seeing it. So let's just make this for right now red. Now if I come in here and I run this, as you can see, our cube is now spinning. And because the cylinder is anchored and the motor is attaching the cube to the cylinder, it's keeping the cube from falling. Now if I come up here and I take anchoring off of the cylinder, you'll see that it falls, and now both parts are affected by the motor. Now because the cube is laying flat on the floor, it's preventing the cube from spinning, so the cylinder is actually spinning. So that's where knowing how and what to anchor is very important. So in this case, we know that we don't want this to move. We know that we want this to be connected to this, but we want this to move. So that's why we have set it up the way that we have, to where our motor is handling all of those connections for us, and we're still allowing physics and motion to be affecting this block by keeping anchor off. Now another thing to show you as well, if I come up here and I select our cube, if I turn anchoring on, it's preventing the motion from happening. And this goes back to what I was saying about being selective in where and how we use this, so that we are in control of our movements and we don't have these kind of issues where you're looking at it going, oh my god, why isn't this moving? Just keep that in mind. Anchor does prevent all types of motion. So now, all of that being said, I'm going to finish building this out. First thing we're going to do is switch our part color back. Let's actually go with a grayish. That'll work. And we're going to introduce a different type of surface now. Now, as mentioned, the motor is attaching things to the cylinder. We want to be able to attach other parts to this. But again, if we start anchoring things, they're not going to move, and that's not desired. So we're going to weld them together. And if you know anything about metal shop or anything like that, you connect two pieces of metal together and make them one by welding them. And we're going to do something similar to our part. So we're going to come up here back to our surface tool, and we're going to select Add Weld. And just like before, we have a surface selection. Now if I select one of these surfaces, it changes the appearance of that surface. And if I scale this out, you can see what that looks like. It's kind of this diamond plate. And what this does is any part that is in contact with that surface is going to stick to it. So it's like they're glued together. So if I go and I undo the scaling here, I'm going to apply that same surface to our remaining three sides. We do not need a weld on the bottom one right now. If you wanted to add something like a light or something like that, you could go ahead and do it that way and add another weld. But we're going to skip that step for right now and just focus on our four sides. Now I'm going to create a duplicate of this block, drag it over here, and let's come down here to our properties and remove all of our special surfaces here, because we're not going to need them on these other parts. So everything is set to smooth now. So these parts are touching. So if I play this now, you're going to see that that cube is now sticking to our moving cube, and it's moving right along with it, which is exactly what we're looking to happen here. So we've not anchored anything here, we've not done anything special other than just change what our surface type is, and it became the glue that allowed these parts to stick together. So now let's go ahead and modify this part so that it looks a little bit closer to what we want it to. So I'm going to start by changing this to 0.2 and grab our scale tool. If I bring this down, let's make this nice and thin, and we'll bring the width in just a little bit. So let's take a look at that. That was a little too much. There we are. Let's bring it back to one stud and lengthen this out. That looks pretty good right there. Now I'm going to duplicate this, grab our move tool, bring it on over to the other side. Let's make sure that we are in contact. We are. So we have a blade on each side, and then I'm going to duplicate again. And this time, let's bring this to the middle and rotate. Again, we're at 45 degrees. And then bring that to that side and duplicate. A little too far there. All right, so we now have 4 fan blades all touching our weld surfaces on the cube. So now, come in here and run this. We have a working fan. We've not had to do any scripting at all. We've not had to go in and add any special parts or anything like that. Just simply using the tools offered in the parts section of our model tab, and we now have a fully functional ceiling fan. And you can do a lot of things with this. You can create windmills. I've seen some builds for different wipeout games that use similar techniques. There's a lot of ways to do this. Clock hands, gears, you name it. So this is a really universal set of tools here that you can use to do a lot of really cool things and not need to dive into any scripting or anything like that. So I would love to see what you guys come up with on this. So if you wanted to send me some screenshots or video clips of some of the neat things that you've done with this, I would love to see them. One thing that I do want to point out with this, the weld does have some very interesting properties to it that are a little bit annoying sometimes, and I want to point this out before you run into them yourselves and think that you've done something wrong or something like that. And one of those things is with rotation. Okay, now as you just saw, this part is sticking really well to it. But if I come in here and let's change this to 15 degrees, okay? If I give this a slight rotation, which if you pay attention to the way the fans are constructed, the blades are rotated to direct airflow, right? But what's interesting about the weld surface, if I apply that rotation and I come back in here and I run this again, our fan blade actually falls off. It's a very annoying thing that you'll encounter. So if you find yourselves with parts that are not welding properly, take a look at that and see if you've done any odd rotations with it or anything like that, because that can cause this to happen. It can cause that glue to break. And similarly, if the parts are not, if the surfaces are not touching each other exactly, they won't stick. So keep those things in mind as you're building, just to prevent some headaches and a lot of time wasted. But that is something that you definitely want to keep an eye out for. So that's all for tonight. I hope you guys have enjoyed this little video, and it sparked a few ideas for things that you would like to create yourself. We will start getting into some more advanced concepts soon, I promise. We're starting to get into the fun stuff here. So if you haven't already, do me a favor and like and subscribe. If you have any feedback on any of my videos, please drop a comment. I will look at them and respond as soon as I'm able to, and I'm going to keep the videos coming. We're going to start introducing a scripting series coming up pretty soon, so I'm very excited to get you guys involved in that, and we will do our best to get through these as fast as possible so that we can get to some of the bigger game creation stuff that's going to ultimately allow you to create your own games. So thank you so much for sticking with me, and until next time,